Welcome to today's presentation, Planning for Educational Inclusion. This presentation is brought to you by Pacer Center, and it is partially funded by the Minnesota Department of Education. My name is Julie Herzog, and I am on the Pacer staff, and I will be assisting today's presenter, Barb Ziemke. Today's webinar is scheduled from 11:30 to 1 and will be followed by optional question and answer session. This presentation is designed to provide participants with an overview of planning for educational inclusion for children with disabilities. A PDF of today's presentation, titled Presentation Slides, along with several supporting handouts, was emailed to all participants who had registered by 10 a.m. as of Monday morning. If you have not received the handouts, please take a moment to send an email to julie.herzog@pacer.org. And once the presentation has started, I will follow through on those requests. Today's webinar is also being recorded and will be archived to the Pacer website within the next 4 to 6 weeks. All participants' phones will be muted during the entire webinar. Participants can ask or submit questions to the presenter using the question answer feature, which is located in the lower portion of the webinar toolbar. Type in your question into the white box and click on the send button. Other participants will not see your questions, and we will not identify the person asking the question. We will try to address as many questions as time allows. An overview of today's agenda includes Part 1, what is educational inclusion? Part 2, a discussion on placement in the LRE and access to the general curriculum. Part 3, key factors in inclusion success. And then there will be a wrap-up, which will be followed at 1 o'clock by optional question and answer. I am pleased to introduce today's presenter, Barb Ziemke. Barb is a parent advocate and trainer and project coordinator at Pacer. She is the parent of a 20-year-old son with a developmental cognitive disability and hearing impairment who has been successfully included for much of his school career. Barb currently serves as a parent advocacy representative on Minnesota's Special Education Advisory Panel. I will now turn the presentation over to Barb.
Welcome, everyone. In today's audience, there are parents of children with disabilities of all ages, as well as school staff and other professionals who work with children with disabilities. The majority of the audience today is from Minnesota and from every part of the state. But in addition, we have participants from several other states and even one other country. But we all have one thing in common. We care about a child or children with unique challenges, and we want to help them succeed in school and in life. So it's my hope today that you will learn at least one new thing you can put into practice in the coming weeks that will make a positive difference in the life of a child, probably your child. Before we get started on planning for educational inclusion, I'd like to take just a minute to introduce you to Pacer Center. Pacer Center is Minnesota's Parent Training and Information Center, and in recognition of how important parent involvement is in special education, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act requires a Parent Training and Information Center in every state. And Pacer is our center. But in addition, Pacer does its own fundraising and also competes for government grants to provide a whole variety of other programs and services to families. And it would take far too much time to tell you about that, so I just encourage you to visit pacer.org, click on Programs and Services, and you can find out about all of the resources that are available. In addition, Pacer participates in a coalition of 18 what we call disability-specific groups. And so we're often making referrals to those organizations for additional help and resources for families. At Pacer, I work within our Parents Helping Parent program, which provides training and advocacy to parents. We also provide resources to professionals who contact us. And all of Pacer's parent advocates are parents of children with disabilities. So in addition to whatever our professional background and training is, we have firsthand experience with navigating special education and sometimes also the social services system. And we provide our help to families in a variety of ways. One is in workshops like this webinar today, We also produce lots of written materials, excuse me, and we try to provide really accurate, up-to-date information in language that families can understand. And then we also provide assistance through what we call individual advocacy, and the bulk of that is done through phone calls. And so just please keep in mind, if you have a question or a concern, you can always call PACER's main number and ask to speak with a parent advocate, and one of us would be glad to help you. As we get ready for the inclusion workshop today, I'd just say a word about our workshops in general. We try to balance content, and often the content is related to the law, with ways to use that content, and then also try to address your questions. And we present the way things are supposed to be, and then provide information about options and choices. So in today's audience, I imagine that there are those of you who are both brand new to the special education process and others who are old pros, but even the most experienced of us, even those of us who are advocates who do this full time, we find we have holes in our knowledge sometimes. And also, just about the time we think we know something for sure, the law changes. So while you may find some of today's information kind of just a reminder of what you already know, other pieces will provide a new way of looking at a situation. And sometimes that's just exactly what's needed. Because inclusion is really a gigantic topic, and you couldn't cover it in an hour and a half, or a day and a half for that matter, I will be hitting the highlights and providing a framework that you'll want to fill in based on your own unique situation. And in addition to the content of this hour and a half presentation, after the presentation, be sure to reference the related publications and a list of online inclusion resources. And also remember, we're here to help you, so please call our parent advocates if you have a question specific to your own child. And if you have a question during today's presentation that would be of interest to the group, please use that Q&A feature on the webinar toolbar. I'm going to begin the presentation. We're having a little bit of technical difficulty here. There we go. There's a puzzle piece on this first slide because I wanted to remember to share a strategy, puzzle solving strategy that I always used with my daughter when she was younger and liked to do those great big puzzles. Since this is what I shared with her, since the frame pieces all have one straight edge in common, first find those pieces and put them together. And then once you have the frame in place, it'll be far easier to insert all those individual pieces because you'll have a frame of reference for each adjoining piece. If you look at a big puzzle on the table and you start with a random puzzle piece, it's so overwhelming and can be so frustrating. But if you gain some initial success by putting the frame together first, you get some momentum going and you get the hope that you'll actually be able to complete the puzzle. And so the first portions of today's presentation I'm looking at as the frame building part. We're going to look at special education law and current practices as it affects educational inclusion, kind of put that frame together. In the third part of the presentation, I'm going to share some tips and some strategies that might help you as you consider how you're going to fit the unique puzzle pieces into that big picture. So let's begin first with the big picture of inclusion. Inclusion is really a philosophy or a concept, and it's often applied to other aspects of diversity and is sometimes viewed as a civil rights issue. Inclusion is an all-encompassing practice of ensuring that people of differing abilities or attributes belong, are engaged, and are connected to the goals and objectives of the whole wider society. It often upholds the attitudes and beliefs that everyone has value, everyone belongs, everyone contributes, and we're better together. The focus of this workshop is on educational inclusion for students with disabilities, specifically inclusion in the public school setting. The educational inclusion movement began in the mid-'80s. In the 70s, students with disabilities who had been excluded completely from public education were brought into the public school system. They were there, but they weren't necessarily participating in the regular classroom setting. Over time, attention shifted to the concept of mainstreaming, or sometimes we talk about the term integration of students with disabilities, often taking students from their regular special education setting and providing some time for them to mix in with the other students. But really over that period of time, there was kind of a mixture of success and failure in the inclusion attempts. And when it became kind of obvious that being physically included in a classroom didn't necessarily lead to meaningful participation, the pendulum shifted to more specialized services and supports delivered in carefully designed special education environments. And really, through the years, we see that that pendulum continues to swing. Because inclusive practices vary by state and by school district and even by school building and individual student level, it's really challenging as parents to know what should and can we expect regarding our child's inclusion in education. Parents often want to know, what are my child's rights? And what are our rights as parents in making the decision about where our child is educated? When it comes to students with disabilities, rights and responsibilities are determined by legislation, either Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So in today's workshop about inclusion of children with IEPs, we'll look primarily to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, hereafter to be known as IDEA to save time, for answers to those questions. That concept of inclusion is embedded in IDEA, although the term inclusion is not part of the law. IDEA 2004 in the Congressional Findings section says that Congress finds that almost 30 years of research and experience has demonstrated that the education of children with disabilities can be made more effective by having high expectations for such children and ensuring their access to the general curriculum in the regular classroom to the maximum extent possible in order to meet developmental goals and, to the maximum extent possible, the challenging expectations that have been established for all children, and be prepared to lead productive and independent lives to the maximum extent possible. Since there's a variety of different things people mean when they say inclusion, we will lay the groundwork for today's workshop by deciding how we'll be using some key terms. So first of all, what is educational inclusion? And here's just the most recent dictionary definition I could find. That inclusion is the practice of educating students with special needs in regular classes for all or nearly all of the day instead of in special education classes. And there's some additional terms we're going to be using. A neighborhood school is the school the child would attend if he or she didn't have a disability, and the regular classroom is the classroom the student would attend if they didn't have a disability. The general curriculum, and we'll come back to this topic later, includes the lessons, materials, and activities routinely used by the general population of the school, and then free appropriate public education. Free means no cost to parents. Appropriate has a definition of education suited to the needs of the child. And we're also going to talk today about LRE, which is the least restrictive environment. And really FAPE in the LRE, those are some acronyms that are kind of at the heart of special education. But least restrictive environment means that to maximum extent appropriate, school districts must educate students with disabilities in the regular classroom with appropriate aids and supports along with their non-disabled peers in the school they would attend if not disabled. And here's the key distinction, unless a student's IEP requires some other arrangement. So since LRE is at the heart of inclusion, we're going to come back to that in quite a bit more detail. But first, let's look at the two main models of inclusion. When many people talk about inclusive education, and including me when I speak about my son, who I'm going to be sharing about, when I say that he was included in the regular classroom, we're often saying that we're referring to the first of these two models. While the majority of time is spent in the regular classroom, special services may include some what we call pull-out services taking place in a small group or individualized setting. Sometimes people refer to this as partial inclusion or regular inclusion. Then the second model there is full inclusion. And under full inclusion, special services are often termed push in rather than pull out because they're delivered in the regular classroom. And advocates for full inclusion would say that there really can't be any such thing as partial inclusion or it's not inclusion. Most frequently, we see this full inclusion model at the early childhood and primary grade levels and in schools intentionally planned as inclusive schools. And we're going to talk more about what the characteristics of those schools are later. And then another term that is kind of in this mix here is mainstreaming, and it's a related term used in a variety of ways. Generally, the student's primary placement is in the special ed classroom under mainstream, but the student goes into selected classes or activities of the school day where it's been determined he or she can be successful. And we often see these be the specialist classes like art or music or lunch resets and physical education. And sometimes under mainstreaming, there's kind of a requirement to earn your way into the regular setting, especially as it relates to behavior. But there really is not a one-size-fits-all to inclusion. And here at PACER and as an advocate, I hear from families on both sides of the issue, those desiring more specialized, individualized, direct services for their child, and those desiring more time spent in an inclusive setting. And parents of students with what we term more significant disabilities often report their challenges in obtaining individualized modifications and supports, especially perhaps like peer professional support, that their student needs to succeed in the regular classroom. We especially see this as more challenging at the middle school and high school level. And sometimes parents call because rather than first considering the regular classroom, teams may start with looking at programs for similar students. And those programs often may not be housed in the neighborhood school. And so in today's webinar, we're going to look at how should that decision be made? How are decisions about placements and services to be made at the individual student level? And before we talk about how those decisions are made, I guess we need the why to. Why do we want to direct all this attention and energy? And perhaps one of the most important pieces to talk about are the benefits of inclusion. Before we do that, though, I wanted to just share a little bit about how I came to learn about how important it is to be involved in that decision-making process. And this will just serve as background, too, as I share some of my own experiences as part of this webinar. On the screen right now, you're seeing a picture of one of the handouts for parents that we sent as part of this webinar materials. And this is the LRE, an English translation of key legal requirements piece. And when I actually moved to Minnesota when my son Brandon was going to be going into grade school, and because he had been successfully included in an early childhood program, it was an early childhood special ed program that was co-conducted along with a Head Start program, and he was successful in that program. And then he went to a grade school that was an inclusive school, set up for inclusive schooling. So he was in an inclusive, regular kindergarten classroom. Then we moved to Minnesota, and it was time to go into first grade, and we wanted him to go to his neighborhood school with the kids in the neighborhood and his sister. But when I first made inquiries, it kind of was presented to me that there were some good what were called center-based programs for students that were similar, and they looked like great programs, but they weren't in the neighborhood school building. So the choice was going to be, it was offered that he could attend one of these other schools even if he was in the regular classroom, but to be in a building where they had a site-based or center-based program, he'd have access to the resources. And I really didn't know what our rights were around our input into that decision-making process, but I knew about parent training information centers, and so I called PACER. I spoke with someone. First of all, she was also a parent, and I found that extremely helpful that it was someone who had already gone down this road and had some experience with it. But probably the key thing that happened out of that call was that they sent me this handout, the 1995 version of this handout. And it gave the law and then the common translation. And because I got the information and I understood that the first consideration should be the regular classroom in the neighborhood school, I was able to prepare myself as a fully informed team member to participate in the discussion and the decisions around placement. And as it turns out, that that consideration, that first neighborhood school placement, did turn out to be the least restrictive environment for Brandon. So I just wanted to share that as we move forward with this, that because I got the information I needed and we were successful in an inclusive setting, I really witnessed firsthand the benefits of inclusion. And so just briefly, and there are so many benefits, but some of those that are most often cited are that for the benefits of inclusion for students with disabilities, the relationships with classmates without and with disabilities can create a real sense of school belonging, classroom belonging, that there are peer role models for typical behavior and development, which creates a sense of identity. I'm a first grader or I'm a second grader. The high expectations and standards create a sense of achievement for many students. And also, the inclusive setting in school is preparation for life in the real world, and a sense of reality that we live in a world where most people don't have disabilities. In addition to these benefits, it's interesting and important to note that there's no research to support that there are more academic gains for students in segregated special education classrooms, which is usually a reason why parents might place them there, thinking with the more individualized, smaller setting that you would see those gains. There actually is some research that supports that there are more gains both academically and socially for students included in general education classrooms appropriately, and that there are no negative effects to the achievement of general education students in an inclusive classroom. Now, for general education classmates, not only are there no negative effects on their achievement, but there are some real benefits to them as well. Research shows that many times those students gain understanding and learn to value contributions of all different kinds of people. They may benefit from having additional staff people in the classroom, which often are providing academic and behavioral supports or adaptations, or like in a co-teaching situation, there's differentiated instruction, different approaches to teaching that other students are benefiting from, as well as the student with a disability. Those students also tend to view disability and diversity as a natural part of life. And as a result, they're better prepared because they're going to be our future teachers or employers and doctors and neighbors and even parents of persons with disabilities themselves. I just want to read a little email letter that a student in high school wrote to his teacher as a result of him being kind of buddied up together with my son in high school and sharing lunchtime and developing a relationship. I just thought kids themselves say it so much more eloquently than adults. But this email to the teacher was, "Dear Miss, myself and a few of my classmates have been spending our lunch hour getting to know Brandon a bit better. I think I can speak for most of the people at the table and say that eating with Brandon has taught us all a little bit about ourselves. You begin to see that just a little bit of your time can mean so much to people, that eating lunch to him is more than just re-energizing himself for the day, but a chance to be with people that he looks up to, and to be with his friends. It makes you think about things in your own lives. Some of the people at our table, I don't think they spend as much time as others with Brandon, and I don't really know why. Maybe it's because they're just too selfish to spend 15 minutes of their time, or maybe they're just afraid of change. I don't know the answer. All I know is that there are few people at the table who enjoy spending their time with a person as worthy as Brandon. Brandon is a living teacher for all of us. His energy and enthusiasm teach us lessons that will forever stay in our memories long after we leave Apple Valley High School. When I read that, of course, I'm just reminded of what a cool student this is, this young man. But those are the kinds of benefits that classmates cite about having classmates that have differences and differing abilities in their classrooms. But if it's so great, why is it so challenging? And it is challenging. And as I work with families and go to meetings where there's disagreement over the extent of participation in the regular classroom, there's kind of some key concerns that frequently are raised. And these are some of those. When there are behaviors that interfere with the child's own or their classmates' learning, or if there's such a limited attention span and focus that the classroom methodology doesn't fit well. For some students, there might be hypersensitivity to environmental factors that might not be able to be very controlled in the general setting. Or if a student has a need for extremely highly structured, consistent, predictable schedules and activities. And if you're around schools this time of the year, you know that sometimes it's just not possible in the general curriculum not to have changes or new things that are coming up as you go through the day. However, the fact that there are these possible challenges, and there's others, doesn't mean that inclusion shouldn't be considered or attempted. What it means is that the IEP team is going to have to look at and determine accommodations, modifications, supports to proactively address those concerns. We say to set the student up for success. For example, in that first challenge, when behavior might impede learning, IEP teams should look at the need for a positive behavior plan. And we have a handout in your materials on functional behavioral assessment and positive behavior supports. And we also have workshops and materials on our website that can help with that. There's also some challenges based on just the school setting. And these are delivery of instruction to students as a group, trying to coordinate special education with regular education, the logistics and scheduling issues, regular education teacher preparation, and regular ed teachers themselves in research cite that many times they feel unprepared or for sure underprepared to know how to include students with significant disabilities in their classroom, and they would like more preparation. And then there is, as always, and even more on the forefront right now, the funding and staffing resource challenge. Experts suggest that inclusion really works best with the right supports in place and that a school-wide emphasis on such things as positive discipline, staff training, adequate funding, and commitment to supports in all the classrooms, along with a strong communication component, is really essential. And today we're talking about the individual team process, but school reform and the inclusive schools movement is a national movement, and it indicates a need for change at a school building level. Just like the students, schools need to be set up for inclusion success. So even while advocating for positive school-wide change, parents will need to deal with the what is now in my school, not the what should be, in planning for their own child's educational inclusion. We're just going to take a quick look at where we're at right now with inclusion, because sometimes people wonder, how are we doing? So I've given you some demographics here. I guess probably the significant thing about these facts is the variability by different factors. As a whole, we say that 52% of students in special education are spending at least 80% of their time in the regular classroom. But then when you see the breakdown, it really varies a lot by category. So for instance, 88% of students with speech-language impairments are spending that 80% of time or more in the classroom, but only 12% of students with intellectual disabilities, which is what we're kind of including in our terminology for more significant disabilities. And there are other variations by disability category as well. One of the puzzling and concerning factors is that African American students with disabilities are more likely than students of any other race or ethnicity to spend less than 40% of their day in the general classroom. And they were more likely to receive education in a separate school facility. And this is something we are concerned with and trying to address in Minnesota. And another major component, and if you're a parent you may be experiencing this, is grade level. The amount of time in the regular classroom decreases significantly from elementary school to middle school to high school settings, especially for those students with the more significant disabilities. And when we use that terminology, we're using the terminology of Fisher and Jorgensen, who have, and they say those are the students who have traditionally been given the labels of, in the old terminology, mental retardation, or we now say intellectual or cognitive disability, or autism, the deaf blindness category, traumatic brain injury, and or multiple disabilities. And later on we'll talk a little bit more about why inclusion is so much of a challenge in secondary school, but just briefly, sometimes there's a either-or approach regarding functional and academic needs. It's hard to get a both-and kind of approach. Scheduling and the school structure in our large high schools often drives the programming, and so there's less flexibility. Just the trimester or semester teacher-classmate changes make implementation and communication really difficult because you don't necessarily have a home base or one person that you're communicating with. And then also just the larger academic and developmental gap for many students as they age. But although it's a challenge, we see that inclusion can work. It takes, though, a strong partnership between parent and schools and really an underlying belief in the benefits. If everybody in the partnership doesn't believe in the benefits, it's going to be hard to maintain the motivation to do the extra work it requires. So we're going to suggest some tips for middle school and high school inclusion in part 3 of today's webinar. But along with any questions you're wishing to email in today, also if you've got some tips about inclusion at that secondary level, we would love to share those with the group. Now in Minnesota, this is how we're doing compared to national, and I'm not going to take too much time going over this. Just keep in mind that each percentage point is about 1,000 students in Minnesota. And in addition to the other factors we've already talked about, in Minnesota there's variability by geographic location. So you may look at this percentage and think, that's not how it is at my school. Well, that might be because we see more inclusion in suburban districts and statewide in districts with fewer than 2,000 students that are not urban or suburban districts. And then we see less inclusion in Twin Cities school districts and then the larger districts in greater Minnesota. So it really varies, and what's going to matter to you is what's happening to your child. Now we're going to talk a little bit about, based on that, what's the goal for least restrictive environment. And in February of 2008, the Department of Education Office of Special Ed Programs was asked a question, and they answered it in a letter. The question was, is there a specific percentage of students with disabilities that must be educated with non-disabled peers for more than 80% of the day? And their answer was that IDEA does not prescribe the number or percentage of children with disabilities who must be educated in any particular environment. But each state needs to set a target for what we call the LRE indicator in each state's required state performance plan, and then they have to report progress towards the target in their annual report. And so for Indicator 5 on educational environments, you can see that Minnesota targets, we're not quite meeting them, and we're participating in activities to move closer to the target. Now we're going to move on to part 2, which is placement in the LRE and access to the general curriculum. And this is my favorite slide in the presentation because that handsome young man in the middle with glasses on is our son Brandon, and he's here enjoying lunch with some of his high school lunch buddies. And later on I'm going to share more information about how we actually work towards that in his educational programming. So I'm just pausing here a moment. IDEA's LRE principle expresses a strong preference, not a mandate, for educating every child with a disability in the regular education environment. That, again, is language directly from the Office of Special Education Programs. And this is where, on this slide, you'll see the reference at the bottom of the quote is 34 CFR. I just wanted to point out that CFR is Code of Federal Regulations, and we have the IDEA statute. Then we have the regulations, which kind of tell us how to carry out the statute. We also have Minnesota statutes, which can go beyond the requirements of IDEA, not provide less. And then we have Minnesota special education rules, which tell us how to carry out the law. So there's a lot of layers to this, and it's important to know what the law says. But around LRE, IDEA establishes a presumption that children with disabilities will be educated in classes and settings with their non-disabled peers unless the education of children with disabilities cannot be achieved satisfactorily in those classes and settings with the use of supplementary aids and services. We're going to kind of break this down. The purpose of LRE, and it's important that it must be, this least restrictive environment must be individually determined and based on a student's individual needs. It applies to all children with disabilities, not just certain categories. And that faith in the LRE we talked about, the free appropriate public education and the least restrictive environment, is really the central components of special education. And it's what we need to look to when we're determining whether or not we are appropriately determining placement for a student. Just really quickly, I want to give you a visual that we use in what we call our IEP workshops, because we're kind of transitioning here into, okay, how do I use the IEP process then to determine appropriate placement for a student? And we show this kind of house of special education slide because one thing we want to point out is the importance of the foundation. You know, you can build a house, but if it doesn't have a good foundation, it's going to fall apart. Sometimes people want to start with the roof, like where is the student going to go to school? But you really need to start in the IEP process with the foundation, which is evaluation data. And in our IEP workshops or in our IEP materials online, you can get all the details of this if this is a new process to you. But the purpose of this slide is just to look at the order that things occur. First is the evaluation, then the team determines the student's needs, then you determine what you're going to do to meet those needs, then you look at it and you say, where can we best carry this out? What's the least restrictive environment for this IEP, this Individualized Education Program, to be implemented? It's just a reminder as you're going through the process. Sometimes when you have a challenge and people call us, the first thing we'll do is try to help them see where are you at in the process. Because jumping ahead or getting things out of place, like, you know, a parent might go to a school and say, I'm contacting you because I want my student to have a paraprofessional. A request for a paraprofessional needs to be related to a need, and there needs to be some evaluation data. So just to keep this in the back of your mind as we work through the process. But IEP shouldn't be written to fit a predetermined placement. The IEP should determine placement. Let's look at this a little bit more in depth about LRE placement decisions. Once the IEP team decides what services a child needs, they decide where the services will be provided. And placement decisions are to be made on the basis of strengths and needs of the student. And just a reminder not to lose sight of that strengths portion. Also, made on the basis of the environment in which the educational goals and objectives can appropriately be carried out. I'm going to give you some tips relative to that later. Then also consideration is given to any potential harmful effect on the child or on the quality of services that he or she needs. And you determine placement only after IEP goals and objectives have been determined. Then the placement, what we call location. Okay, and really the planning sequence may end up being more circular than a straight line for students for whom you're considering some placement options. You might have to kind of go through the line with one option, and then depending on whether or not you're considering another option, you might have to circle back around and recycle through those steps before you finalize placement and services, because services and placement can change. Services can change based on the placement sometimes. And again, if you have individual questions about that, you can give us a call. Another really important piece, and this is the last bullet on the slide, is that parents must receive prior written notice. This is a really important part of the process as far as parents' rights. When you have a discussion and parents will call us and they'll say, what can you ask for? Well, you can ask for anything. If the question, sometimes really is what do they have to do? But when you ask, if you make a request in writing or if the school is making a proposal, let's say about a placement decision, the parent has a right to prior written notice. Sometimes a district calls that the notice of district's proposed action or denial. And that needs to include the educational placement of the child to be initiated, an explanation of why they're proposing that placement or perhaps refusing a request, and then a description of each evaluation procedure, assessment, record, or report the agency used as a basis for the placement decision, and a description of other options considered and why they were rejected. So this is a really important piece. If you are not in agreement with the rest of your school IEP team, it's always really helpful to get the prior written notice so that you can see their reasoning, the basis of the decision, and then you also, with that, have an opportunity to agree or disagree. And we have information that we can share with parents about what to do if you do disagree. There's many options in Minnesota for conciliation, facilitated IEP meetings, mediation. There's all sorts of things that you can do. And that's another workshop, so I won't get into that here today, but be sure to call or email if you have questions. And we already talked a little bit about this initially, that the first placement option to be considered is that regular classroom, and that would be also considering what appropriate supplementary aids and services would be needed to facilitate such placement. And parents sometimes say, well, when wouldn't the LRE be the regular classroom? But it really is individually determined. I just want to give you one example, would be the LRE for a profoundly deaf child is sometimes what is seen as the totally restrictive residential school for the deaf. But that, for that student, is a place where communication is totally unrestricted. And for the student to meet his needs, that's required. This is why we don't want to make black and white judgments about LRE, but we really want to go back to that evaluation data, needs of the student, and determine what's appropriate. In addition to the law itself, there's the statute and the regulations. There's also guidance from the law that comes in the form of court interpretation. And there's a lot of words in this law that are open to interpretation. Words like appropriate, achieved satisfactorily. I don't know about you, but even between the two parents in our family, we sometimes have a hard time agreeing on what's appropriate as far as discipline or expectations for our kids. And so, when you get a team of people, an IEP team together, you may not always have the same interpretation of appropriate. So when court cases go to court, especially in our own District 8, those court decisions also inform us. And again, we don't have time to go into that, but I just want you to be aware of that there are court cases that have lent weight to decision-making about LRE. Another important component is, as we mentioned, what supplementary aids and services are needed. And they really play a major role in making inclusion possible. And before considering alternate placement options, the team really needs to consider what supports are needed. And these can include all sorts of things, accommodations, a modified curriculum, direct services and supports, staff support. Sometimes it's through consultation or maybe a behavior specialist, healthcare assistance, paraprofessionals, which can be a major issue. Also, support and training for staff who work with the child, the need for specialized equipment or communication aids, social interaction support. So this is what the team needs to consider before they make a decision about whether or not a student could be successfully, or I should say appropriately, placed in a particular placement. And then we're going to just take a look here at one of the other considerations, and that is that while the first option to consider is the regular classroom in the neighborhood school with supplementary aids and service, it's not the only option the law talks about considering. And I often have had parents ask, can the school suggest that my child be educated in another location or program in the district? And the answer is yes, they can if that's appropriate. And actually, the school district is required to have a continuum of alternative placements available to meet the special ed and related services of individual children. And those placement options include a variety of settings along a continuum, and that's described in IDEA as from regular class in a neighborhood school to special education, resource room assistance, separate classrooms, private schools, residential, hospital, homebound, correctional, and detention facilities. So there is a wide range of possible placement options that are actually within the law. And in addition, the requirement is to make provision for supplementary services, such as resource room or itinerant instruction to be provided in conjunction with regular class placement, and consideration must be given to any potential harmful effect on the child or the quality of services he or she needs. And this is sometimes a sticking point. For example, if a student's behavior in the regular classroom interferes with his ability to learn the content of the curriculum, either because he can't learn while engaged in other behavior or can't pay attention, that could be an appropriate reason for an IEP team to determine that that may not be the appropriate placement. And the other part that's sometimes disconcerting to parents is that the law does not require that each school building in a local educational authority, which in this case is school districts, be able to provide all the special education and related services for all types and severities of disabilities. The school district has the obligation, and that's why sometimes within a school district, a team might place a child outside of their neighborhood school because the program that's appropriate is in another building, and that is within the law. So with all of this to consider, I guess the real question for parents is, what can parents do if they are wanting to increase the likelihood of a more inclusive setting? And there's lots of things parents can do. Parents are an equal member of the IEP team, and you know your child best. I really believe that parents are the expert on their kids, and we need to work in partnership with people who are experts in their field and experts in teaching. But really, a lot of the information about your child, you are the best person to know the long-range, big picture. And so if you can describe and provide documentation of your child's strengths and needs and share helpful information from outside assessments, or like, for instance, if you have a consultation from our computer center here, our Assignment Technology Center, share that information. We included a tool for you to kind of document some of your and describe your child's unique strengths and needs, and I'm just going to take a quick peek at that with you. It's the introducing your child to the school community, and there's a template that you can fill out. The finished product looks something like this, and it's a way for you to share information in a one-pager, which professionals who are really busy are more receptive to than if I bring in a whole packet, to share pertinent information with the people who work with my child, but it also serves to help me as a parent have to really define what we want to be working on long term, what we want to be working on this year, and the key pieces around strengths and challenges. So I encourage you to utilize that as you prepare for an IEP meeting, a new school year. Then also, if you can determine a relationship between strengths and needs to a placement setting, consider ahead of time which goals would require participation in general education environment, because remember, your IEP is going to determine placement. So if I have IEP goals around socialization, interpersonal communication, learning the hidden curriculum, extending my child's attention span for challenging work, that leads more to participation in the general education environment than if my goals are all around maybe working on functional skills, zipping, and things like that. So consider that relationship. And then prioritize academic, functional, and developmental goals. You can't do everything every year. You only have 6 hours in a school day. And it really is the hard work to determine what's really important right now, what in my child's age and developmental stage, what are the most important things, and try to advocate for goals and objectives that are related to those areas. It's as an equal member of the team, the pre-meeting preparation that you do can really lead to good benefits. So ask yourself, how could my child benefit from being in the regular classroom with typically developing peers? And think long-term. Recognize you can't address all the areas of need at the same time with the same intensity within the school day. And so ask yourself at this time, which areas are the most important to focus on and address? And then what kind of instruction and interaction is he or she most likely to benefit from this year? And what areas can we address outside of the school day? Well, I think of as a family, I would try to free up more time in the school day and in the IEP for areas that we would take on, like, community involvement, independent living skills, all sorts of things that we could do as a family unit to free up time for priority areas that required either specialized instruction, like in reading or written language or math, or that required peer group interaction. So, I can help my child learn to carry out work-related chores at home, but I don't know how to deliver specialized reading instruction. I can work with my child on, using a clock and a calendar, but I can't teach him how to interact appropriately in a large group structured setting or how to learn to respond to group norms and rules. So think that through and be prepared to share what your priorities are for your child. Again, you can use that document. We have other helps available as well. And then probably the best thing you can do, I always say it's not really knowing what to say or what to give as far as information, it's knowing what to ask. So if your child's not participating in the regular classroom to the extent you feel is appropriate, or if you find yourself in a setting where the team is proposing a less inclusive placement than you desire, it's important to ask some of these questions. Ask, what are the barriers to my child's participation in the regular classroom? And what supplementary aids and services are needed? What's been tried? What can we still try? And then when you hear something that you think, I don't know, that sounds like an opinion, just ask, what's the basis for that determination or that proposal or that opinion? If there isn't a basis of evaluation data, maybe you need to ask, could we do some assessment in that area? Because you seem to see it one way, I see it another. It would be really helpful to all of us to know actually how he's doing or how she's doing in that area. And then a good question to ask when it seems like people are trying to make a decision and they're not clear on which direction to go, ask, does the team have all the information it needs? What other information do we need? Maybe you need to add somebody to the team. If you're struggling with why isn't a child making appropriate progress in reading, for instance, maybe we need to ask to have a specialist, a reading specialist, join the team and help determine that. And then another really good question is, can we implement a trial and collect data? When people are saying, we don't know if that would work, a good thing to say is, could we try it? And if it doesn't work, let's get back together again and talk about what options are. And just a little tip, rather than asking, can we do such and such, ask, what do we need to do to make that happen? And then, so what do we need to do to make a lunch group happen? And then you'll get a response. And then you can say, what do we need to do to make that happen? And carry that forward. And then also, it's just a really good idea, if you're going to be participating as an equal member, to have equal information about options. So ask questions about the next year ahead in time to gather meaningful information, do observations about possible placement options. This is really important when you go from elementary to middle school, and then again when you go to middle to high school. I suggest starting a year ahead of time to gather information, to schedule observations. If there's going to be a decision between several placement options, try to get firsthand information about all of them. As a parent, I've sometimes gone into it thinking one way and come out thinking another way when I've been open to all of the information and considering all the variables. And again, we can help you with that. If you have individual questions about your own child, you can give us a call, and we have some information that we can share with you about tips for going to observations and what kinds of things to look for and what kinds of questions to ask. just really quickly, I want to hit just the highlights, and this relates to inclusion. We've already talked about IDEA and what they say about the least restrictive environment, but also the provision, the key features in both the 1997 amendments and the 2004 are the concept of all students, including those with the most significant disabilities, are to have access to the general curriculum. And this is actually incorporated into the definition of special education, which is specially designed instruction. And here it says, which means adapting as appropriate to the needs of the child, the content, methodology, or delivery of instruction to address both their unique needs that result from the child's disability and to ensure access of the child to the general curriculum so that the child can meet the educational standards that apply to all children. And we talked briefly when we went through the definitions about what those things mean. But what's important to remember is that special education is not a place, and the purpose of the IEP is not to develop an individual curriculum, but rather an individualized program of services and supports that are needed to enable the student to make progress in the general curriculum, the activities and content that all the students in the school are using. And those are related to state standards. And so with effective team planning, access to the curriculum can take place in and out of regular and special education classrooms. And just a quick review, that the general curriculum is that general curriculum that's aligned to grade level state academic content standards. And just keep in mind that all children are first general education students. Special education is a subset of that group. And so the Beach Center on Disabilities says that access to the general curriculum refers to the education of students with disabilities in the academic, extracurricular, and other activities of the schools they attend. It also refers to their progress in those three components of the general curriculum and their participation in state and local school district assessments. And then the National Center on Learning Disabilities states that IDEA's access to the general curriculum mandates ensure that all students with disabilities have access to and benefit from a challenging curriculum and are held to high standards and expectations. Those are related to our state standards. And in Minnesota, there are state standards for language arts, which includes both reading and writing, math, science, social studies, and the arts. And then at the district level, we have our standards for health, PE, vocational technical education, and world languages. And you can get complete information on the Minnesota Department of Education website. You can look at the standards, and then for each grade level, let's say for reading, there are benchmarks. What should third graders be learning? And see what the standard is. Then the team's going to look at ways, should be looking at ways to incorporate grade level elements from those general curriculum at an appropriate instructional level for the individual student. So again, you might want to take a look at those standards when you're trying to come up with what should we be considering as part of this program. You should be considering what are all other students at that grade level learning, and then individualize it for your student. And most students on an IEP will be assessed or tested on those academic standards. A very small proportion of those with the most significant cognitive disabilities will be assessed with an alternative assessment based on alternative academic standards, but it's still going to cover the same content areas. And just because we're a little bit, we have less time than in a live workshop here today, I'm going to just refer you to the information that we included in your handouts about state and district-wide assessments and accommodations for those assessments. We had some very comprehensive outlines, handouts that outline both the requirements and what parents can do to make those decisions. IEP teams make decisions about participation. What I want to highlight here is that all students are to participate in the MCAs or the Minnesota Test of Academic Skills, which is the alternative. No student is exempt. And so the IEP team needs to determine what's appropriate for each student. And we're working in Minnesota on what we call a third level of testing for students who don't fit that alternative category of most significant cognitive disabilities for the MTest. but that's not going to be rolled out probably until like 2011. But you can get more information in our handouts on our website and also on the Minnesota Department of Education website. And just for those of you who have children with more significant disabilities, I just wanted to let you know that this MTAS academic skills test is it's a different kind of test. And so I like parents to know that this is not a paper and pencil test with bubbles. It's activity-based, and it's administered individually, one-on-one, by a familiar staff person. And so and their participation is required under both No Child Left Behind to show that schools are teaching the content that they're supposed to be teaching, and through IDEA. And how you can participate in IEP decisions about assessments is to request information ahead of time about what are these tests and their purpose and their format, and when are they given them, and what samples, questions, and then to determine as a team what the accommodations are. You might want to, if your child may be affected for post-secondary education, learn how alternate assessment options may impact them as far as information that might be on their transcript. And then also, there should be a relationship between the kind of accommodations that are going on in the classroom and the ones that are required for testing. Now I want to just shift gears to kind of what I call more the implementation piece and some of the tips for inclusion. There really are some keys to successful inclusion in general. Now it's very individualized, so I don't want to make any blanket statements, but research has shown that there's some characteristics of parents that seem to be helpful in this process of making inclusion work. And some of the things that are really helpful, because parents often drive the inclusion process, even though they can't do it alone, but their ability to effectively partner with the school is essential. You cannot educate a child in isolation at school. You cannot educate a child in isolation at home. You've got to work together cooperatively. So, the goal isn't getting the student physically in the classroom or in the school. The goal is meaningful participation, which just is going to mean teamwork and buy-in from everyone. So parents who ask for information, because you have to get the information to be well-informed enough to participate as a team member. Parents who learn to understand their child's disability and figure out how their child learns best and can contribute that. Parents who take an active role on the team and don't see it as me and them, but us, because that's really what it is. And I encourage that language at IEP team meetings. Instead of saying you, say, what do we need to do as a team? Also parents who are persistent, and I have found through the years that I often have to, just stay on top of it, be the reminder, because I have one kid to care about. And everyone else on the team has a whole lot of children to care about. And so that persistence, at the same time being flexible, which for some of us is harder than others, and then being assertive. And you'll notice I didn't say aggressive, because with teamwork, aggressive doesn't work so great. But being able to say what you mean in a respectful way is a really important piece of this. And then parents who find ways to support school and teachers' efforts. No one wants to be involved in an effort that's constantly a failure. Everybody wants to feel successful. We as parents, the educators. And so when people do things right, rather than taking it for granted, finding an opportunity to encourage and reinforce those things that are making things work for your child is really powerful. And then another really key piece of successful inclusion is the classroom teacher. And the classroom teacher, research shows, is really key for most student success. But for inclusion particularly, a teacher who is welcoming of all students and promotes a sense of community, and a teacher who has training or experience on inclusion, or maybe some personal experience with people with disabilities, or shows a willingness to learn. One of Brandon's best inclusive grade school settings was with a new teacher who said, I don't really know how to do this, but I'd really like to do this. And she was just great. Also, a classroom teacher who receives support that they need from administration and special education, and a teacher who has a style that matches the needs of students with disabilities. Perhaps one who just by nature teaches in more of what we call a differentiated style, uses lots of different methodologies, not perhaps just one lecture-based kind of methodology. Then another piece of that research supports is that often the principal is the key to making inclusion work, and this is especially true at the middle and high school levels. I would have to say it was the principal for us in middle school who was key, and then an assistant principal at the high school. And these are, if they value diversity and inclusive school communities, if they recognize the need for and provide time for educational team collaboration, when they make provision for classroom resources because they see the value, and the same is true for seeing the value and making the provision for training for all staff around the inclusion of students of varying abilities, it's really a determining factor. So you might consider, for instance, if you're going to be making a move to the middle school, to schedule a meeting with the principal during the summer. Introduce your child to the principal, communicate your positive expectations and your desire to work in partnership with the school, and provide that student snapshot or another a one-pager of your child's unique strengths and challenges and your hopes for his education there. So there's lots of ways that that person who makes hiring and firing decisions is influential in the success of students' inclusive placement. And then another key person can be a special education administrator. When you're having difficulties maybe at the team level, you might want to ask for the involvement of either the special education director or, in some districts, a special education supervisor or coordinator. What you're kind of going for is a special educator at that administrative district level rather than your local school building, because they will have knowledge and resources and options outside of just that local building, and experience with all kinds of students and different kinds of disabilities, and they're in a position to help facilitate collaboration between the special education component and the regular education. Those administrators can arrange for and provide specific kind of training opportunities for their staff, and they can serve as a facilitator of parent involvement on the IEP team. They're often relied on as having a lot of current information about requirements under the law, and so that's really helpful to a team. Another big component to successful inclusion is the school itself and the school environment. And this could be a workshop all by itself, so I'm just going to hit some highlights, and I'm going to let you read what's on the slide. These are all cited by research of components of successful inclusive schools. And in addition, schools that have heterogeneous rather than homogeneous grouping of students, where they're not all grouped together by ability, including all types of diversity, those schools are more readily able to support inclusion. Schools that set up social circles of support for all students and training and development of staff is really an important component. And the need for school reform at a systems level is a reality, really, to make broad-scale inclusion of students with all types of disabilities a successful reality. And there are some states and localities that have particular initiatives to do some of these school reform efforts. And you can find out more information about that on your list of online resources. So we're going to move now to some kind of practical tips. Some of these I share from my own experience. Some are from other people's experience or families I've worked with or research. There's lots of things a parent can give input to the IEP team around, and some of the items would include, and actually I want to just back up to say here in this tip section, I'm talking primarily about inclusion of students with what we call significant disabilities. In general, students with learning disabilities or ADHD or speech language are pretty much included for the majority of the school day in the general classroom, with perhaps some limited pull-out services. Where we see the challenge is students who have what we call more significant disabilities. Especially right now, we see a big increase in the number of students with autism and just the whole developmental cognitive disability area of students. We have less inclusion. So these are some tips for those students that are more challenging to include. write social inclusion goals into the IEP. You could ask teachers to purposely facilitate friendships by intentional grouping or pairing of students. One idea is to schedule some kind of game time once a week during speech therapy where 2 regular ed students can volunteer or be chosen by the child each week to play some kind of game together. We always found it helpful that the child could bring a treat or pop to share with that group. In middle school, if there's a middle school adjacent, which there often are in some school districts, have some middle school student buddies integrated into coming over to help in the classroom, and other students will think it's cool and want to join in. You can request intentional teacher or classroom selections to be made by the principal with input from the IEP team, and then do those things that help the school community get to know your child. Use that handout. You may want to, especially at the grade school level in those early primary years, find a way to share with the class about your child. We've got a lot of tips around that and strategies if you want to contact us. But one way is to sponsor the Count Me In puppets for school assembly. Or another thing is just in the way that you talk about your child. Encourage you not to describe your child by a disability label, but by their unique strengths and needs as you're talking with your team. There's as much difference between 2 students within a category, like developmental cognitive disability, as there is between any 2 students in general education. The label does not describe the student. And so find ways to describe your child without using that label. And then I kind of had this philosophy that my child's not going to be included in the school community if I'm not included in the school community. So find ways to volunteer occasionally in the classroom or at school-wide events so other people will get to see you and know you as a family. And avoid, as a parent, only participating in special education-related activities. Join the PTO or serve on the site council. Have birthday parties and invite the class to your house, or invite individual classmates over. And sounds obvious, but have fun stuff to do, good snacks, and some way to facilitate positive interaction. Often using older sibling for that is a good strategy if they're up to that challenge. I also would say here, visit and consider participation on your local special education advisory council. Every school district or cooperative of school districts, and this would include charter schools, public charter schools, needs to have a special education advisory committee or council, and they need to include at least 50% parents, and that's to give advice concerning special education programming. And you can visit our website that's on the slide here, or you can email me or call me for more information about how you might become involved at the SEEK level. And then let's move on to middle school inclusion ideas. As I said, research shows it gets more challenging. Some of the things you're going to do the same as you would do in grade school, like include social inclusion goals in the IEP. But you might also want to ask for some what we call familiar friends classroom placements. Just a classroom or a lunch hour with at least 1 or 2 students the child had a positive relationship with in grade school. Can't always do it for a variety of reasons, but my experience is that all things being equal, they're often able to make sure that there's somebody that's a good match. In middle school, there's often an activity time connected to lunch, and this lunch bunch concept I've referred to can often be carried out where you have, during that lunch activity time, some students who join the student with special needs and an inclusion facilitator of some kind, which could be a variety of people, because as they get to know them individually, usually that carries through to other kids getting to know them and becoming more a part of that school life. And then consider extracurricular opportunities. There's lots going on starting in the middle school level with plays, there's stage crew, or school fundraising activities are big in middle school. Our son became like the magazine salesman and always got to go on the limo rides. It's a great way for him, who's often getting help, to find a way that he could help his school. Also a great way for other students to see him as someone who contributes. Also just a great way to get to do some fun stuff like the limo ride. There's assistant managers to sports teams if the student can't participate on an equal basis. In middle school, again, this is a time when if there's responsible older siblings or relatives, to kind of facilitate some of the activities. It's just way cooler than parents, especially mom. And then in middle school it becomes more important. Kids get picked on for things different than disability often, like just looking a little bit different. And so noticing what other students wear to school and helping your child select age-appropriate clothes, I always kind of used my older daughter to let me know what was kind of cool, and then she'd encourage Brandon to, maybe, not wear the Barney stuff anymore. But so just, considering how that affects a student's involvement at school. And again, go to school-wide family activities, volunteer at parties so you feel more comfortable with your child attending. I didn't know about that middle school dance thing, so, we signed up to help at it because I could see what was happening and also be contributing. And then at middle school level, if you haven't already in grade school, you may want to pursue finding out more about how assistive technology might help your child be included in the classroom to make up for some of the skill deficits or communication deficits. You can ask for an assessment from your school district, and you can request trials of different kinds of equipment. And again, if you go to our website, you can find how the Simon Technology Center could help you in that. Then it's moving on to high school, which many parents report as being, particularly challenging as far as maintaining inclusion. And I have to say for us, in high school we started to do kind of both, taking advantage of some of the what I call center-based activities, because it was our goal for Brandon to have friends both with disabilities and without disabilities. And what we saw was in the mainstream classes, there tended not to be other students with similar kinds of challenges. And so we wanted to provide opportunities for both. But there are some things that you can do. You might want to, if you're a big high school that's divided somehow into houses or, they have different names for it, you might want to work with your IEP team to provide input about appropriate selection of those kinds of groupings within the high school. Again, you could request to include at least one friend or a friendly accepting student in the lunch hour in a class or two. We found it was really helpful to tap into the National Honor Society and the mentorship program students as possible social inclusion facilitators. Many of those students are looking for opportunities, and with help from adult counselors or advisors. We have very good success with that. Also, the developmental psychology and sociology classroom teachers who are already providing opportunities for students to learn about development, human development, can help in creating opportunities for shared activities. And that lunch bunch that I showed the slide before and read the email from, for Brandon was an activity created by the developmental psychology teachers. Brandon went into those classes, students got to know him, different students signed up to be lunch buddies, but also then ended up developing some friendships, and actually he went to his first high school basketball game because that group of students took him. He went to Twins games. So, but the developmental psychology teacher was the one who facilitated that, and technically she wasn't even a part of his IEP team. So you look for people who kind of get it and can help you in your efforts. Then we tried to plan for at least one extracurricular activity each semester and plan for supports as part of our IEP process in high school. And, I just want to throw in for realism that at that high school level, students themselves provide a lot of supports as far as transportation to those extracurricular activities or, however it gets arranged. And parents in high school provide a lot of support. And you might expect that you're going to be needed to provide that support as well. So, some of the activities that you would select and want to have your child participate in may require some extra help from you to make that actually happen. But planning it as a part of the IEP process it will ensure that there's a much better likelihood that you'll be able to find something appropriate and be able to provide the supports that are needed. I also encourage the team to look specifically at schedules and classroom selection options, planning ahead to choose electives that allow for group interaction, like some of the general ed home ec classes, cooking, art, or child development classes, some of the fine arts classes in art. There's just more natural opportunities at the high school level to actually interact with classmates than, say, calculus or one of the higher level science classes. So plan intentionally. Also, we found it helpful to find ways for our child to volunteer at school events, again, being included in that school community in a function of giving. And so, you know, such things as even handing out programs and greeting people at concerts and plays, or collecting tickets, or selling the food, participating on stage crew again, or painting sets. There's just so many ways. You've got to get creative, and you have to think of what fits your child's strengths. And that's where, you know, developing that ahead of time can help you in that IEP process. And then I would just say in high school it's important to select classes, both special education and regular education, by the ability of those classes to meet your child's unique needs. And also to encourage your team not to look either or, like either he's in special ed or he gets to be a mainstream student. Instead, look at a variety of ways to meet needs. For instance, for our child, he could be in regular classes for social studies in high school, some of the English classes, even a speech class. For math, what he needed was a small group setting, and that was through a program for students with neurobiological accommodations, an NBA program. They had 5 kids with very individualized math needs, so he was in that class for math. He was in a class for students with learning disabilities for science because of the way that class was carried out and how it met his learning needs. And then he was in some special education classes where he worked on the functional skills that other high school students weren't working on in any other classes. So encourage your team to look not narrowly, that's a hard word, at categories, but to look throughout the whole school coursework catalog and to choose classes based on your students' individual strengths, interests, and needs. And work collaboratively with the IEP team, knowing that, you know, you're taking your best guesses, you're doing the best you can. Some things will work, some things won't work, but you can get back together as a team and work towards creative solutions and options. And, you know, just in general, what I really hope to communicate today is that when educational inclusion is done well, done appropriately, really everyone can benefit. And it is a lot of work. I would say as a parent, it took more work on my part. I know for many of the teachers, for the general education teachers, for the special education teachers, there was a lot of effort that resulted in success, but I believe the reason why it was successful is that everyone could see that there were benefits to both the student, to his classmates, to the teachers who report really growing and gaining in their skills and just their sense of purpose and accomplishment, and the school community as a whole. And so it is it's important. It's important work. It's not always appropriate for every student, and that's really important that parents are involved in making decisions, but ensuring that every child is included to the maximum extent appropriate is well worth the time, effort, and teamwork that's required. And one thing to keep in mind, because as I said at the beginning, this is a huge topic. I know it leaves many, many unanswered questions, but there are lots of resources. On your resource slide, you can see PACER's contact information. Also the U.S. Department of Education, which I referenced in the presentation at idea.ed.gov, has great resources for families there. And then our Minnesota Department of Education website is full of information. And if you have a hard time finding what you need or navigating that, you can also contact us. And then that separate piece on selected online inclusion resources, I encourage you to kind of explore that. And again, you know, if you have questions about your individual child and concerns or just want help navigating the special education process, please be sure to give us a call because we would love to help you. And now, I believe we are going to be able to address some of your questions.
Hi everyone, this is Julie. Thank you for participating. Upon exiting today's webinar, you will receive an online evaluation. So please be sure to take a moment to complete that. And also certificates of participation will be emailed within 24 to 48 hours. And today's presentation is being recorded, and we will archive it on PACER's website within 4 to 6 weeks. And at this time, Barb is taking a look at some of the questions. Our audience has submitted wonderful questions, and you can keep them coming. She'll begin addressing those questions, and we'll respond to as many questions as possible. We understand some of you will probably be leaving, and so this is an optional Q&A time. The method for sending your questions is to type it into the white box on the lower right of your screen. And when you enter in your text, just hit the send option, and I will be passing along those questions to Barb. Again, your questions are anonymous, and we will not be identifying the sender of the questions. So at this time, Barb has had just a second to look at some of the questions, and she'll begin responding to them in just a moment. Thank you.
I just have to tell you, you asked some wonderful questions, and there's way more than I know we can address today. So just in advance, I apologize if we don't get to your question. And perhaps sometimes we're able, with our archived webinars, to add some include some of the questions with some responses to those, and we'll try to do that if that's possible. I'm going to just kind of go in line here with some of the questions. One person asked where they could get a copy of the student snapshot sample. They saw the blank template and said, should there be 3 pages? It's divided into 2 handouts on your attachments. So the blank template is separate so that it's writable. So it's not a PDF, it's a document. And then the introducing your child to the school community is 2 pages of description of how to do it with a sample. So you need to print both of those handouts to get the 3 pages, but the one is available for you to write on. Okay. Then there is a question, and I'm glad you asked. Do you feel that center-based classrooms are beneficial for some students and do have some advantages? Because this workshop was on inclusion, that's where our focus is today. So I kind of focused on the benefits of that. Yes, I have seen that there are some center-based classrooms that are beneficial for particular students and especially appropriate for them. I have worked with some families who have, for instance, children with autism with some very specialized needs for kinds of approaches for working with them that were very successfully carried out within a more center-based classroom. I've seen some students who, because they were successful in a center-based classroom with some, especially in relationship to some interfering behaviors, that later, they were prepared to successfully be in a more inclusive setting. So I definitely feel that it's very individual, which is why I never want to just make a black and white statement. Although I feel very strongly that you should look first at the regular classroom. I am happy that there's a continuum of services because every child is unique. And so, yes, I would definitely see that there are some benefits for some students. My experience, though, personally was it does seem for some students who could be successful in the regular education classroom that it's harder once you're placed in a center-based classroom to move out into an inclusive setting than if you try the inclusive setting and do that as long as it's appropriate for that student. So, it's all individually determined. That's the answer. But definitely there are a lot of special education teachers in very specific kinds of areas where they are delivering excellent education. So we want to be clear about that. And then There's a question of, are PACER services available to persons from all states or just Minnesota? Good question. PACER provides, it's really a national center as well as a state center. I'm not sure if I referenced it before, but all states have a parent training and information center. And when you're talking specific to special education law and rules in your state, I would highly recommend that you contact your state's PTI, we call them for short, to make sure that you're getting state-specific information. But PACER does respond to inquiries from all over the United States. In addition to doing that as an organization, we also house the Alliance, which is a coordinating center that provides technical assistance to all the states' PTIs. And so we can, if you're from another state or if you're a parent or you know a parent in another state, we can direct you to your own state's PTI. But at PACER services, we get calls from all over, and we have an 800 number that you can use for those calls. And that's 1-800, I'm blanking out, national number, 888-248-0842. And again, if you go to our website, pacer.org, you can find all that information. Then here's a question. Do you suggest sending a letter out to the parents of classmates introducing your child and encouraging them to help encourage their child to be interactive with the special needs child? And if so, what would you include? I have met several parents who have done that. I did not do that. And again, this would be totally a parent kind of decision, but since you're asking my opinion, I have worked with children in other settings before I was a parent advocate. And in my experience, especially young children and grade school kids in general, the kids have less problems with including children with differing needs than sometimes adults do, just based on whatever our past experience has been. So I kind of relied on the kids themselves if they got the information they needed, usually within that classroom setting through the teacher. When my child was very young, and because of his own unique needs, he didn't mind me coming in. I did go in and talk with the class in a broader sense first about differences and acceptance, but then, a little bit about Brandon and some of his needs. He had some physical needs as well as a hearing impairment. I just kind of trusted that the kids would do what the kids needed to do, and that was my experience all through school. But depending on the unique needs of your child, it might be very helpful if you think parents are going to kind of wonder. And I have had parents I've worked with who did that and had very successful responses to a letter to their classmates. But again, it's individually determined, and I didn't find that necessary ever. So that's just kind of my opinion on that one. Here's a question. Once you request an evaluation, how long should you wait for them to agree to move forward or to deny a request? The school they need to give you a response in a reasonable amount of time. We take that to mean kind of best practices wise, and I believe that comes from the Minnesota Department of Ed as kind of a best practice of a couple of weeks. So if you make a request for an evaluation, the important piece you need to know is you need to put that request in writing. And sometimes parents ask verbally, and sometimes they ask someone who doesn't have the authority to say yes. And it doesn't go anywhere. So the important part is to put your request for evaluation in writing, and you would want to give that to the school principal, and you could copy that to a special education administrator if you felt you wanted to do that, or if you're working with a particular teacher, you want to date it and sign it, and then the school needs to get back to you one way or the other. If you don't hear from them, after a week or so, I suggest just making another contact to just say, when might I expect that? In the letter itself, it's a good idea to say, I would like to hear from you within, a week or something. But once you get if you get a response that they will do an evaluation, there's a timeline that goes into effect once you sign permission for the evaluation, and that's a 30 school day timeline. but that doesn't begin until you actually sign permission, not make your request. So if I didn't quite hit your question, make sure to either follow up with a question or give me a call, okay? Here's a question. There's so many different ones here. I'm trying to get a variety. Here's: my child is about to start kindergarten and has not been assessed formally with any IQ test. Is this something I should request? This one sounds like there might be enough individual uniqueness to it that it might be a good thing to call about. You wouldn't necessarily need an IQ score to make a decision about placement. There's so many factors around evaluation. It's a huge topic, and we have lots of helps around that. I'm hesitant to give, any kind of individual answer to that one. So, I encourage you to contact us about your unique situation. I'll say this: when my son was in the primary grades, I actually asked that they did not do an IQ test as part of an evaluation initially, because he had such unique needs that there wasn't a good way to test him. He had hearing impairment, he had fine motor impairment, a variety of things that made it really difficult for him to do any kind of traditional testing. And I actually requested that they not do that. We did it later when it was more appropriate. But what I didn't want him to do was become labeled with a certain IQ that might unduly influence placement options. And so, again, you can call with specific questions about your particular child. Here's a question: what happens when you view the data differently than the school? And then there's a follow-up question, but I think that's that happens. Two things you need to know. When you get an evaluation report, you have the opportunity to disagree with that if you'd like to, and then you would be able to request an independent educational evaluation. And if that were the case, the school district would pay for that, and you would get additional information to kind of resolve whatever that issue was. Usually you don't have to get to that point. There are some things that you can do when you view the data differently than the school. One thing that I do is I request that I get the evaluation reports at least a day prior to the evaluation meeting, because I need to read it and process it. If I can get it a few days ahead, if I'm unclear about what the data means or their interpretation of it, I can contact individual people to get a little bit more information before we sit down as a team to discuss it. I think the important thing is to ask questions when you view it differently. Sometimes it's just a matter of kind of language of the testing versus language that we as families usually use, and there's all sorts of variables. But I'll give you an example. Again, from my son, when he was going into his early childhood placement, they made a placement decision where they put him in with a class of kids, none of whom were talking at all. And at home, we saw that Brandon was just really beginning to develop speech after having had a hearing impairment and chronic ear infections, and he was kind of coming out of that. But when he was at school, he was never talking. They told us that, and they had data to support that at school he didn't talk. Well, we saw him totally differently. So we took a weekend, and my husband took the video camera, and we just videoed him around the house and in the car and at the grocery store, just kind of jabbering away when people were talking. And so then, I asked the school if they would be open to considering, just viewing this video, which they did, and they, their mouths dropped open because they said, well, he never talks in the classroom. But no one was talking in the classroom. And so because of that, we contributed something to help them gather the data they needed to make a different placement decision, which they did. He was moved to another classroom, and his language took off to the point where, we sometimes wished he didn't talk quite as much. But so if you see the data differently, you have a couple options. You can formally disagree and ask for an independent evaluation. You can also just ask for additional evaluation or assessment in an area. For instance, like around the need for occupational therapy, let's say, or speech therapy, and if they're presenting data that says they, no longer need services, you can ask, well, can we do some additional testing, or can we bring someone else in the team who has expertise in that particular area to give us some advice? So there are options. Although sometimes you just see it differently, and then sometimes you have to go through a disagreement and try to resolve that through one of the alternate methods that we have available to us, and again around conciliation or mediation, and you can contact us for more information about that. Someone wanted to know more about what's a circle of friends, and I referred to that, I think, in the grade school inclusion ideas. Circle of friends is kind of an old term now, and actually refers to a particular kind of social supports that was developed, I believe, in the early 80s. Now it's used kind of generically, like we just say Kleenex, for social support groups within the school setting, and they're done in a variety of ways. But it's an intentional grouping of students with the goal of developing some friendships within a smaller group, so that then that can be generalized to the larger classroom setting or school setting. And in grade school, oftentimes it could be facilitated either by, if there's an inclusion facilitator, sometimes it's, a school social worker does Circle of Friends groups. Sometimes they're cross groups. They're not just kids with disabilities with non-disabled peers, but other kids who have need for a smaller kind of group that's facilitated around the need to learn, it's really not a skill acquisition as much as an opportunity for some children to get to know the student better, so that they kind of become the bridge, the links in this circle of friendship that develops. And again, if you want more information about that, there's some resources on that online resource guide that we gave you, and you can also contact me if you would like more information. Let's see. There's also a question of, I'm trying to choose from very many great questions. How do I find out what training my child's teacher has had in relation to special needs? Now, I'm not sure if they're talking there about the general education teacher or a special education teacher. In general, I would just say you can find out, first of all, the law requires our teachers meet highly qualified specifications. But as I mentioned before, many general education teachers don't receive a lot of instruction formally at the teacher preparation level around disability. So much of it is learned either in continuing education or through staff training or just their own personal experience of having students with disabilities in the classroom. I guess, how you find out is maybe to ask. And I really, it's my personal style. I probably wouldn't say, what training do you have? But I might just engage in a conversation about, have you ever had a child with a disability that, or a child that has pretty unique needs within your classroom before? How did that go? And how did you know, what to do? Is that something that you're very familiar with? Would you, I've often asked regular ed teachers, is there anything I can do to provide information to you that would be helpful? Some people want it and some people don't. And so I guess you can ask. The other, there's no requirement that your general education teacher has had any particular training. But if they need training now, if you have an IEP in place for a student, everyone who works with the student needs to know how to work with the student. And so, paraprofessionals or teachers, anyone in the school needs training. This is particularly true around kids with unique communication needs or behavioral needs. That could be addressed in that way. Also, as far as formal licensure, the Minnesota Department of Education has teacher licensure lookup. You can just by first and last name look at any licensed teacher in Minnesota. It'll tell you their history of licensure and what areas they're licensed in. So there's a variety of ways. I prefer the, if my kid's in somebody's class, just the informal conversation to make sure that you're working together and is there any way you can help them might be the best context to ask those kinds of questions about their familiarity with teaching a student who has some of your child's characteristics. Then it says, how can you determine goals that should require general education versus out of the classroom? I think I know what that is saying. Again, it goes to the unique needs of the child. I would say let's take a content area like English, okay, the English class. If it's middle school English class and my child can comprehend well and can benefit from listening to literature read and discussions about it and learning how you use a story to learn about your world, that time in that regular education English class would be appropriate. If in that regular education English class they're working on the skill of reading and they're working, let's say, individually and they're working at a 6th grade reading level, kind of independent, and my son is still reading at a 1st grade or 1.5 grade level and needs really intensive specialized instruction in reading and needs to do it in a quiet environment because he has a hearing impairment, that's how I kind of determine what would be appropriate. Again, we mentioned this before, with supplementary aids and services, I think the team looks at, well, in order for them to learn this during this time, what will we need to put into place? And sometimes, no matter what you put into place in that regular classroom, it may not lead to appropriate amount of progress in that area, like that reading example. But, I hesitate, again, I'm not giving a blanket answer. There are other ways, perhaps, that you could approach the skill of reading within that general education classroom. But in general, you really need to look at the specifics of classes, and this is, I'll just throw in here, this is a real challenge. A lot of IEP teams sometimes skip the step of actually getting what the kid's schedule from the beginning of the day till the end of the day looks like. What classes are they actually in? And what type of classes are those? Again, no blanket statements about my kid can always be in, a particular kind of classroom or they can never, but to look individually at can they, with supplementary aids and services, make appropriate progress in whatever the objectives are for this particular class. So for us, what was right for our son was a combination of some of those pull-out services for the what I call essential skill areas. He needed more direct, small group instruction for reading, math, and written language. But we had a goal around him learning the general curriculum like other students so that when people talk about shared common knowledge, which there is a base of common knowledge that we all share and can have discussions about, that he could participate. And so in those types of settings, he was included. Another question is, if a child moves from another state with an IEP, how is their placement determined to enroll in a school in Minnesota? Now they go on with some very unique circumstances that I think deserve more than a quick answer, so you might want to call us with that, but I'm just going to address this in general. When you move from another state with an IEP, the new district is going to be able to do their own evaluation and write their own IEP, but initially they're going to try to implement the IEP as much as possible is the same as it was implemented in the former placement. So the difficulty comes, and that's why I gave the disclaimer before that, we're talking about Minnesota, and you might want to, if you're in another state now, contact your PTI, is that from state to state, we have different categories of disability. We have different names for programs. It's often not a one-to-one match when you come from another state. And so it really can be a little confusing to families, and that's where asking those questions is really important too. I'm not sure that I adequately addressed that, so I do encourage you to call if you are in the middle of this situation right now and need some help with that. And then here's, if the district wants to move a child to another school, do you have to agree if it's within the same district? And I just want to be really clear that it's an IEP team decision, not an individual. Okay, so a principal can't make this decision. A special ed director can't make this decision. A parent can't make this decision individually. It has to be an IEP team decision with the 4 required IEP team members, and that is the parent, the regular education teacher if the student is in regular education or may be in regular education for part of the school day, the special education teacher or provider, and then the representative designated by the school district, and that needs to be someone who's knowledgeable about the general curriculum as well as resources and options within the district and can supervise or provide education. Okay, so those 4 components have to come to agreement if you're going to make a change in placement. And that's where if when you say, do you have to agree? No, you don't have to agree. It doesn't mean that it won't happen, but you have the opportunity to disagree and have a conciliation meeting, sometimes a mediation. And, if you remember back, the key here is that if they're suggesting or proposing a change in placement, that would require written prior notice to you describing what's proposed, what the basis of that proposal is, and then gives you an opportunity to agree or disagree with it. So that's the process. Now, the piece of, can a school say that your child may need to attend a building other than their home district to receive the services and supports that are in their IEP? The answer in general would be yes, along that continuum of services piece of idea that, if the IEP leads to a certain placement appropriately, that placement does not necessarily have to be in the regular classroom. But whether or not you have to agree is a different question. And we just have about 5 minutes left. And again, I apologize because there are so many wonderful questions here. Here is, let's see, I have, can the parent request that their child be placed in an alternative school? Can the district refuse to send them to an alternative school? A little bit, I would say the answer is similar to the question I just answered about a change of placement. Parents, if a school district cannot adequately provide what a child needs after the IEP team has determined what the needs are, the district actually has a responsibility to find an appropriate program. Sometimes they do that by contracting with another school district. In some instances, they do that through the provision of actually, a private school placement. Those are very unique situations, and it's situations in which the district is saying, we don't have what this student needs as is required by his IEP. This sounds a little bit different, and so I'm not sure what's meant by an alternative school unless they just mean a different school. And IEP teams can, within a school district, make decisions about school building placement that are different than or go outside of the requirements for other students in the district. But that's if the IEP team would agree with a parent's request. So again, it's using that IEP process, parent working with the team to provide data and documentation and information about why it's needed, because that's the basis, is need. And then if you get to the point where you've had the discussion, it's not going anywhere, you want to put your request in writing, they would need to respond in writing, and that would give you an opportunity to disagree if that were the case. And again, there's a variety of ways to try to resolve disagreements, and you can contact us for more information. I see that our time is really running out. I appreciate so much your involvement today and participation, and the webinar will be archived, and we will be having more workshops and activities devoted to inclusion. We really appreciate if you will fill out evaluations and return them to us, and we hope that you'll remember that we're a resource for you in the future. And I wish you all the best in either your work with children with disabilities or as you parent a child with a disability. I wish you great success. Thank you. Bye-bye.